Good evening and welcome to Exchanging Notes finally. This evening I have the privilege of conversing with the very prolific Cary Fagan. Cary is the author of 6 novels for adults, 5 story collections, 25 children's titles, and he has 5 books coming out in 2019. How he does it, who knows? His adult titles include A Bird's Eye, which was a finalist for the Rogers Trust Fiction Prize. His children's titles include the popular Casper Snit novels and Mr. Zinger's Hat, which was the winner of the Marilyn Bailey Picture Book Award. In 2014, Cary received the Vicky Metcalf Award for literature for his body of work for young people. His work has been praised for a number of qualities, but for me, its variety, its sheer quantity, and its variegated approaches to storytelling speak of an author who is singularly adaptable and very hardworking. This evening, Cary and I will discuss his life and his craft. Cary Fagan, welcome to Exchanging Notes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out. It's very kind of you.
Thank you for waiting.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the misty past. You were born in 1957, if I may date you in that way.
Quite right.
You grew up in the Toronto suburbs in the 60s. In memory, what particularly strikes you or shaped you about your childhood neighborhood, the local characters there?
I think really what shaped me the most was my family. We had a very close family. My dad was essentially a World War II refugee. My mother was born to immigrants into Kensington Market, and they got married, and they moved up to Eglinton, and eventually they moved further north. And we were a very close-knit insular family, and I think a family that in some ways shut out the larger world, and I think that really is what, and the suburbs are really good for that. I think the suburbs are somewhat isolating, in my experience anyway. So I think having a close family and less of a relationship to the larger community was probably, had the most impact on me, I'd say.
You said your father was a refugee from World War II?
Yeah, well, my father was born in Poland, but grew up in Brussels, and then when the Nazis invaded, we're Jewish, of course, and so he and his parents and older brother and sister fled, and I've actually written a children's graphic picture book about this, which is coming out next year. Unfortunately, my dad passed away a couple of years ago, so you won't be able to see it, but they ended up in Portugal, and from Portugal on to a boat to Jamaica. My father spent a couple of years in a British refugee camp in Jamaica, and then essentially talked his way into U of T when he was 16 and got accepted at U of T. So Canada was not accepting refugees, so he came in on a student visa and came on his own, and that's how he got to Canada.
So your father knew how to present an argument. What kind of occupation did he follow?
Yeah, and he always wanted to be a lawyer, and he became a lawyer, and then he eventually went into business, and although he always kept his hand, in a way, in the law, he was basically a businessman.
Yeah. You had 2 older brothers who I gather were better at everything except writing stories.
Oh,
were they easy on you? Was it hard with them?
It's funny because I have a couple of books about brothers picking on a younger brother, but my brothers were actually really nice to me growing up. But my older brothers were always more interested in science and photography and not really the so-called creative arts. And my mother has always been very artistic, and I think I was influenced by her, and I took after her a bit. And I think being interested in those things was partly a way to distinguish myself from my brothers, for sure.
Were you a loner as a child? Were you a social person with a lot of friends?
I wasn't exactly a loner, but my friends were my cousins and my brothers growing up until I was a little later, till I was like 12, 13, when I started to have friends more outside the house. And then I wasn't a loner, but I was never someone with a lot of friends. I've never been someone with a lot of friends. I've always had a few.
You got to pick them carefully, Cary.
I think so.
Now, you always kind of suspected as a youth, from what I gather, that you're going to be a writer. But you said that at the age 16, you decided it was time to start reading the serious writers, and you picked up Charles Dickens, and you were enamored. What was it about Dickens that spoke to you?
Oh, well, yeah, and that is true. I often tell kids that story when they ask me what my favorite book is, because I did very consciously decide I knew since I was about 12, I wanted to be a writer for some reason. And so when I was 16, I decided I should read more, because I wasn't really that huge a reader. My brothers were much bigger readers. So I did go to my school library, and there was Charles Dickens' Great Expectations sitting there. And I didn't know much about Dickens except that he, was long dead, and I thought it would be terribly boring. And anyone who's read Great Expectations, and a few of you I'm sure have, it's a very thrilling book. So first of all, I discovered the thrill of an exciting plot, and extraordinarily defined, if somewhat exaggerated, characters and atmosphere and heart. I think Dickens kind of has everything, really. What's not to like?
Dickens always strikes me. Dickens thinks that society is not too good, but he believes in this sort of overarching social order. So with Dickens, there's a sense of right and wrong.
Yeah, that's very true. There's obviously a very strong moral heart to the story, but it doesn't mean his characters are. In Great Expectations, Pip is not a profoundly, seriously moral person for most of the story. He's a very flawed person, and yet a person worthy of caring about. And I think I was very attracted to that, and I was also really attracted to the whole idea of a coming of age story. It is a perfect story in some ways for a 16-year-old to read, because it is about the education of a young man and how he grows from being a boy into a man. And I still love that kind of Bildungsroman.
Speaking of education, you attended the University of Toronto from 75 to about 78 or so?
Something like that. I graduated in 80, actually, so 76 to 80, I think.
Okay, yeah. You won 8 student awards. What were those awards for?
Yeah, they're not really, they meant a lot to me at the time.
Yeah.
They weren't really, in retrospect, a big deal, but they were to me then. So it was, 7 of them were from I went to University College, and they have these Norma Epstein Awards, and I would always submit a lot of work and win a few awards every year, and that was very helpful in terms of encouraging me. And then there was one award for work in a creative writing workshop, and at U of T there were only 2 workshops, and then the 2 profs just got together and decided who it should be, and I won that year, or I think it was the first year the award was. So, but those things really, they seemed huge in my mind to me at the time, and they seemed, they obviously confirmed to me that I was doing something I ought to be doing.
And also, there's also in the 70s, I guess it was very much a different world than it is now. No social media, word of mouth was word of mouth. When you think of that time and you think of your coming of age in the 70s, what are the qualities we've lost from that world? And what are the qualities that maybe you're glad we've lost or we should regain?
That's a big question. I don't think my ideas are very different from everyone else's. I think we're all big. Most of us are big users of electronic media, and worried about how much we and our children use it, and that's certainly true. And the problem with the attention span. I think, but one of the differences, it's not really what you're asking me, but when I started, the interesting thing is, I think publishing has changed so much. And so when I started, the literary magazines were often, done on IBM Selectrics, and I started my own literary magazine when I was in university, and there was like Coach House, and there was Anansi. There weren't as many small presses, and the large houses like Penguin and Random House, they weren't really publishing Canadians, except for very, very few, and mostly nonfiction. So it was really later that suddenly everyone became interested in reading Canadian novels. I mean, it really, of course, it started partly with Margaret Atwood, and not that there were Margaret Lawrence in the earlier ones, but really this kind of explosion of who's the new novelist and being interested in first novels that really didn't exist when I started. So my ambition was really, if I could just get published by one of these really little presses, that would be, like, to me, that was heaven. I didn't know, there was no imagining being published by a really big publisher at that time.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about your apprenticeship a bit. Your first story collection, History Lessons, came out in 1990. But prior to that, you had stories in small magazines, essays, reviews, and Globe and Mail books in Canada. When you think of your apprenticeship, what was it like for you? What were the highlights and what were the low points?
I think there were more low points than highlights. It was a long slog, actually, because, I came out of university with some awards and being published in some journals and feeling pretty good. And then there was basically nothing for about 10 years. So it was really very difficult before my first story collection. I wrote 2 novels and a linked series of stories, 3 full-length manuscripts that took me sort of 10 years to write overall, and none of which got published. And that was, I call them the dark ages. I mean, it was very frustrating, very difficult. There was no indication that I would really ever get published, get a book published. I was doing a lot of freelance writing, so I was writing for Books in Canada and the Globe and Mail and other newspapers and magazines. And so my name was kind of known as a reviewer, which I didn't like at all, because I didn't want to be known as a critic. I wanted to be known as a fiction writer. So it was actually very frustrating for me. And but the thing is, I think I'm a slow maturer. I don't think that, some people write a great book when they're 22 years old, and that just wasn't me. And so, I can look back and recognize that those manuscripts showed some promise, but were not worthy of being published. But at the time, of course, it was, heartbreaking to get turned down.
Well, you kept going by optimism or self-delusion?
Both, of course. And, also, once you start digging a hole, of course, it gets harder and harder to climb out of it, So you put your eggs into a certain basket. But it was something I still loved doing and wanted to pursue. But it was hard. It was emotionally hard in those years to deal with that much rejection. And, of course, back then, too, it takes a long time now, but, everything was by mail, and it would take so long. There's most heartbreaking one was a big publisher, Penguin Books, which held on to a manuscript of mine for a year, claiming to be interested in it before they finally turned it down. And I remember it was just like, it was kind of hellish, just waiting and then hearing a no, to wait that long, so.
From those first 2 collections, History Lessons and The Little Black Dress, Tales from France, are there a couple of stories that stand out for you more than others, possibly for technique or difficulty in composition that forced you to examine your craft, or any stories that really come out at you now and you say, yeah, that story was important to me as a writer, as an artist?
Right. I would say more overall. I think they were important though as collections, because when I was writing, my History Lessons was the first one.
Yeah. And
when I was writing them, I felt that they were better than the work that I had done, and that I had was kind of drawing together the threads of what I had learned by writing the other manuscripts. And yet at the same time I was writing stories that I could probably handle better. In fact, I thought writing them that I probably wasn't meant to be a novelist. I mean, having written these 2 failed novels, I was thinking I probably shouldn't be writing novels. And I wrote these stories, and I could tell that they were better than the work before, and they were more mature. And I think, and that was in my early 30s by then, and it just took that long in terms of becoming a human being and becoming a writer both. The other thing I want to say about it is, for would-be writers out there, that there's that Mark Twain saying, "I believe in luck, and the harder I work, the more I have of it."
Yeah.
I think that was true for me because I kept sending out these manuscripts that were being rejected, but it was ultimately one of the publishers, Hounslow Press, that rejected the novel that accepted the stories. And it was because they turned it down, but they wanted to do a new line of short story collections. So they asked me, having just seen my work. And so, it was luck that I happened to be on their desk at a certain time. But that luck happened because I kept sending the work out, and even when it got rejected, I had a policy of essentially not, once I got turned down, within a week I had to be sent out again. It was just, I just made myself keep doing it.
What do you think were the weaknesses you had to correct to really achieve that stage? Or if you'd like to be a bit more optimistic, what were your strengths as a writer at that time?
I really think, in trying to write novels, that I really had a hard time with the novel form, with the development of a story over a long period. And even now, I think there are some novelistic strengths. I mean, every novelist is different, and and everybody has their strengths and weaknesses, and part of what you have to learn is to play to your strengths and find ways to get around your weaknesses. And I remember I once interviewed Michael Ondaatje, and I asked him, how come you don't write conventional narrative stories? Why is that? And he said, because my mind is too screwed up, I can't. So, but he writes these amazingly, visual, imagistic scenes that are so strong, and he strings them together and creates his narrative through these scenes. He finds his own way to do it, and we all have to. And I think that I had not found, my way. I mean, one of the novels that failed, I took that novel a little bit later and said, I'm going to cut out every scene where somebody is just, in a bathtub thinking, and just leave all the active scenes where something actually happens.
Really? Yeah.
And I had like 10 pages left. I mean, there was nothing left of the novel, basically.
You were thinking too much.
I mean, my characters it was so passive. My characters just weren't doing anything.
I wanted to ask you about your first novel, The Animal's Waltz. Toronto bohemian Sheila Hirsch goes to Vienna to learn more about an obscure poet. Why was it necessary that be your first novel? What was the thing about that story that made you think, yeah, this is going to be a novel?
I think it was the character of Sheila. It was her voice, because as I say, I had decided probably I wasn't meant to be a novelist, but then this voice came to me of this young woman who had a family situation which was not too unlike mine. She was, and so she was living this downtown Toronto life, but every day she'd go up north and work in her father's mattress factory, and was still very connected to her Jewish family, and had, kind of mixed feelings about her life, but the story is really a father-daughter story, and it was just her voice came to me so clearly, and I guess I was ready to write a novel. And the other thing that I did was, I read a novel by an American writer named Philip Lopate, who's much better known as an essayist. He's very well known as an essayist, but as a novelist, he did 2 or 3 novels, and most people have never heard of them. He wrote one that a friend recommended to me called The Rug Merchant, and I really liked this book. It wasn't like a great novel, it was a good novel, but more to the point, I read it and thought, that's the way I could write a novel. Because I wasn't very good at writing the slow connective tissue between scenes, and he just left those out. He'd open a scene with a character and his mother having an argument, and then the next chapter would be a completely different scene in a completely different place, and he just jumped a lot between scenes, and I thought that's how I could solve my problem, by doing that. And so I think if I hadn't read that book, I might not have written a novel. And then I actually I took that novel apart and schemed out every chapter and saw how it worked, and then wrote an outline of my own that worked in a similar way. And then as I wrote my book, it moved further and further away from that, but still it was really important for me in finding a way that I could write a novel.
Now, your second, your third, your fourth novel, for those keeping track of time, we're up to about 1997, 1999, 2003 here. Sleeping Weather from 97, Felix Roth from 99, and The Mermaid of Paris, 2003. The thing that strikes me about these three novels is that they could be arranged into a trilogy, beginning with Felix Roth, going through Sleeping Weather, and ending with The Mermaid of Paris. Something about the individual and the group, people entering a world, people leaving a world, redefining their identity in relation to others. Is that a recurring interest with you? Is that an excuse to really kind of look at what makes up self?
Apparently, because I hadn't really seen it that way. I think, I can see what you're saying, and I think that it's true, and I think I'm interested in how an individual, because my characters tend to live a lot in their heads, and their relationship with the people around them is important and sometimes problematic, and their connection to a sense of reality. And so, thinking about a person in relationship to the larger group, I think is something that I do think about. To me, every book that I've written has been so much its own, that and seems to come from its own place, that I don't see the continuity the same way. Mm-hmm. And in fact, they tend to, for example, Sleeping Weather, which came after The Animals Waltz, was very much a response to The Animals Waltz. I tend to turn against somewhat what I've just written and write something somewhat different. And The Animals Waltz was, I think, a very pleasing book. It was a semi-comic book, a warm family novel, more conventional, I think, with a more conventional ending, and people liked it. And I have a feeling that if I continued writing that way, I would have had a kind of smoother, more, in some ways, more successful kind of, middle brow kind of career. And I don't mean that really in a pejorative way. But I actually, after I wrote it, I wanted to write something completely different. I really kind of rebelled internally and wrote a much more somber novel, a more laconic, a more darker book. And after I finished Sleeping Weather, I started Felix Roth, which in a way was slightly a return to The Animals Waltz, but I hoped better. It was, more of a back to kind of Jewish characters, and it was a livelier story, and it was also semi-comic, but I hoped a more original take. So I see them often as responses, negative kind of responses to each other.
So you're sort of evaluating your career with every book?
I think I don't know, it's not really evaluating my career so much as just what seems exciting to write next.
Okay.
And I also think that's normal too. It's, to me anyway, that if you've written in a certain way, you don't feel like writing in that exact same way again. You want to, at least me, I want to try something different. So I think that accounts for the variety. Otherwise I get bored. So.
Let's talk about characters a bit. In those 3 books we've been talking about, Felix Roth, The Mermaid of Paris, and Sleeping Weather, you have 3 strong male characters at different stages in life. Let's talk about your relationships with your characters. Are there any characters you're closer to than others? Any characters who have taught you more than others?
Interesting question. I know that I related a lot to the character Felix Roth. Felix Roth is about a young man who wants to be a writer, and he goes to New York in part because he's going with his brother, who's threatening to sort of disappear into a Hasidic religious sect in Brooklyn. But he also is going hoping to meet Isaac Bashevis Singer, who he's a great fan of, and he gets kind of involved in it's almost like a picaresque novel. I mean, there's a lot of action that happens when he gets involved in a lot of things when he gets to New York. And the story is totally fictional, but I definitely Felix is some kind of a version of how I saw myself as a young man. Obviously not identical, but so that was a lot more explicit. I don't really write autobiographically in that. Even then, sort of everything that happens is fictional, and for the most part, I don't try to base characters after myself or that closely to people I know. It's just not what interests me. So, I definitely would say. I learned. I don't know if it's so much I learned from the character as learned from the process of writing the story and seeing what happens. Because I think most writers hope that their books will be smarter than themselves and better than themselves in some way. And I think they are. If you're writing well, your books are better than you. Which is why it's so disappointing to meet actual writers. And so I definitely, if I'm writing well, I'm definitely getting to a place I didn't expect to getting to some sort of truth, not capital, maybe small t, truth, through the story that I maybe only saw very foggily when I wanted to write the story, but didn't know that I was going to get to. So I definitely do learn, but not specifically through a particular character.
Do you learn from your readers? Do you meet your readers much? And any good ideas, any not so good ideas from them?
Sometimes. I mean, the best was a kid's, was this boy once in a class. I do a lot of class visits and library visits, so I do a lot more interaction with kids because of my kids' books than, as an adult writer, a new book comes out, and I might do 1 or 2 readings in Toronto and maybe go to 2 or 3 festivals and do readings. But as a kids author, I'm fairly regularly going into schools and libraries and meeting kids. And I wrote this book called The Fortress of Caspar Snit, which was my first kids novel. And kids liked it. It turned out to be quite popular. And there's a brother and sister in the book, and one boy in a class kind of looked at me very skeptically and said, "How come the brother and sister are so nice to each other?" And that kind of took me back, and I thought that is a good question. And there are 2 more books in that series, and the brother and sister are not nearly as nice to each other in those 2 books. I mean, he made me really rethink that. Now, they still are ultimately very close and helpful to each other, but they do a lot more bickering and irritating each other, and I think they became more real after the first book.
What do you think the ideal qualities of a children's book or a book for a younger reader? And can you think of any books that achieve those qualities, or any of your own books that achieve those qualities? What are you kind of going for to really speak to a young reader? I know that's a vague question.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's an interesting question, but of course, it's not exactly how I approach things. The first thing I want to do is not bore the child reader. As we know, kids are not nearly as patient as adults and won't generally read something just because it's won an award or supposed to be good for them. I think as adult readers, we're willing to hang in there for a book that maybe we don't immediately like, but I think that's less true for kids. So, I mean, a couple of things is, even though my kids' books tend to be somewhat larger than life in terms of what happened, they're not fully realistic, but I still want kids to believe them. I still want them to essentially believe in who the kid characters are and how they feel about things and how they feel about the struggles that they're having within the story and be able to relate to it. So I still want that. I love to make kids laugh, and I think the best kids' books generally do make kids laugh. Otherwise, one of the things I really believe in is that there is no perfect book for everyone, that everybody in this room has very different tastes. When I go to classes, I always say, some of you will like my book, and some of you won't like my book. But if you don't, you got a whole library in your school full of books, and your librarian can help you find books that you will love. And so we don't all have to like the same books. There is no ideal book, I don't think, and I'm glad for that, really.
Do you have a favorite, any sort of sentimental favorite, perhaps, of all your children's titles?
I guess I have some. Kids ask me that, and I always refuse to tell them which are my favorites.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, I have a picture book called Thing Thing, which is quite a bit older now. I don't know, it's at 10 or 15 years old anyway, but it's still one of my favorites. And
what is it about that makes it a favorite?
I think it combines a vibrant story with humor, with a pretty strong emotional center to it. Some of my books are more funny, but I really think that one has a very warm quality to it as well. So I guess that's one of the reasons. And there are one or two of my kid novels that I
Casper Snit is a very interesting character, because it seems to me that what you're doing is you're offering the readers a villain who's lovable, who offers them a way around all the rules that they've been taught for the last 8 or 10 years, I mean, if there's one thing when you're a child, it's that you're not in control. And Casper Snit seems to me to be sort of a way out of that for you.
That's interesting. Again, that's not really a way I've thought of it. But you're right. He is a kind of lovable. He's more a comic villain than he is. There's nothing frightening about him or those books. They're more comic. And he was the first villain I ever created. I have another kid's book called The Boy in the Box, which about these kids who get kidnapped by this sort of traveling circus. And I think those villains, this couple who take the kids, are also somewhat comic, but scarier, and it's darker. And after having written Casper Snit, I wanted to try one that was a little bit darker. But it's interesting because Casper Snit's about a girl named Eleanor who learns how to fly, and when I think about a sense of control, that makes me think of more of that part of the story, and how, because her mother can fly and won't teach her how, and she has to figure it out and learn how, and even being able to control this ability to fly I think that both embodies a kind of kid's desire for freedom and control at the same time, and I think that's kind of an interesting way of looking at the flying as some sort of metaphor.
Now, I have to ask you a question that may seem kind of strange, considering that you have 5 books coming out this year. How do you decide what to write? Do you consciously move between projects for different ages, or you just kind of write them all?
Well, first of all, I have to say I hate the word prolific, which is a word you introduced me with.
Yeah.
And I always think when people say prolific, it's a kind of pejorative word, which means somebody who writes really fast and is sloppy and doesn't rewrite. And I don't mean that you used it that way, but I don't really see myself as I don't feel any more prolific than I just don't really see it the same way. I know it looks like a lot of titles, but first of all, my books are not very long. Look at this is my new novel. It's thin. I don't write. So if I wrote a 500-page book, it would take me a lot longer to write. But I tend to write very succinct stories. I also don't spend mostly a lot of research time. That there are exceptions, and even if I'm doing research, I tend to start writing even as I'm researching. And because I write in more than one genre, I write picture books, and I write kids' novels, and some of the kids' novels are short, and I alternate in adult stories. I'm always alternating. So I think it just has the appearance of being, I do publish a good number of books, it's true, but I think it's a little exaggerated. It's not as much as it seems. In terms of what to write next, I do tend to like to keep myself from getting bored, and so I don't usually work on anything for more than 2 or 3 months at a time, and that would be like an adult novel. And then I put it down, and I will pick up, if I have a kid novel or a kid picture book that's in progress, whichever one just kind of instinctively feels like it wants to be worked on at that moment. And or it might be I don't have, I've published my latest kids novel and I need to start a new one, so I'll see if I can do a first draft of something new. And then I'm always trying to, because I do have to make a living, so it is important for me to finish a couple of things every year, at least. So I'll look to see, okay, I haven't sold anything for 6 months. What looks like I could move it towards actually being finished? So, there's a practical consideration at the same time for sure.
Now, it's been approximately 30 years since your first book. We're 30-some books later. What are some of the important things about your craft that you know now but didn't in the beginning?
Well, I see it as a continuous thing, and I do think my work has improved over time. And what I didn't have was either both the ability and the confidence to learn more as I write. I think, for example, one of my earliest novels, I tend to outline them and plan them because I was really worried about not getting to the end. And now I do less planning, and I allow stories to unfold as I write them. And I think that's something that I've learned to do, and I think the work is the better for it. And it certainly wasn't something I just was able to do at the beginning. I started doing it more with the kids' books, and the kids and the adult stuff cross-pollinate a lot, and I realized I was enjoying writing the kids' books so much more than I was enjoying writing the adult fiction, that I wanted the experience of writing adult fiction to feel somewhat more like writing for kids, and so I've increasingly used some of the not really technique, but just my approach, where I do allow myself more freedom in the writing experience.
So you've learned to trust your instincts.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Another vague question that writers hate. Do you operate by an established beginning to end process, or does every book are you just kind of constantly jumping back and forth among books? And
No, I'm really consistent. So I write a first draft from beginning to end. I always, unless I have some sort of problem, I always do that. I often write first drafts by hand, whether they're novels or picture books or whatever. It's nice to get away from the computer, and then once I'm on it for the second draft, you're on it for a long time. So it's nice to have that quiet. So I'll write from first to end. Then I will let it sit. So I will let it sit. I used to let it sit for a lot longer, but now I'll still let it sit for at least 3 months or something. And then I will do a second draft from beginning to end, and I'll do that anywhere from 3 to 6 times maybe. And then after that, so if it's a novel, I will actually physically type it out that many times. And I just find that I make a lot more changes, and I'm more inside the novel and have more freedom to move it differently if I'm actually not just sort of going in and replacing scenes and stuff, but actually physically rewriting it from beginning to end. And then when I feel it's in pretty good shape, then I will go and I'll work on individual sections. I'll also rewrite on the page. So between every draft, I will, take a pen and I'll rewrite on the pages, and then I'll do the next draft.
Are there books you return to over the years, both for their effect upon you as a reader and also as a writer for how they inspire or teach you? I mean, as a writer, for example, if you're going to say this is the best written book I've ever read, as a work of fiction, what book would you say that is?
I don't know. I find it hard, to go back. For example, I used to think that The Great Gatsby was the best written book that I knew, and I think it's you're agreeing with me, and a lot of people think that way. It's got such clarity and simplicity, and it's moving, and it was an important book for me, but I don't think I could read it right now, or maybe I'll never be able to read it again. I'll never be where I was the first couple times I read it. So it changes. So there are writers that have been very important to me. Chekhov, every writer says Chekhov, and I'm including me. And a lot of Isaac Bashevis Singer, and a lot of the American Jewish writers, particularly earlier in my writing, were really important to me, but I don't necessarily go back to them. I just
And is it primarily for their clarity, for their simplicity, their apparent simplicity?
For some people, for some writers, it definitely was the beauty of their deceptive simplicity. Norman Levine, the Canadian writer, short story writer, was a writer who influenced me that way a lot, for example. Some of them, like those, Bellow and Roth and Malamed and Singer, it had a lot to do with their particular Jewish kind of energy. I mean, there's lots that I really dislike about them now, too, depending on the book, but it was their energy in their language and in the prime kind of animalistic qualities of their very thinking characters that were so driven, I think, that I was really attracted to. And I think at that time, too, when I first started, I actually didn't really think of myself as a Canadian writer. I thought of myself as a kind of, to me this is very BS now, but I sort of thought of myself as that's who I belong to, those guys, and Joseph Roth and Kafka, and this kind of all these kind of secular Jewish writers of more of an international kind of disposition. That I relate to them. I don't relate to rare people who write about the prairies and now I feel very strongly that I am a Canadian writer and a Toronto writer. And this is the community I identify with as a writer, is definitely the Canadian but it was less so when I was younger.
Did you feel then that as you were younger, the Jewish faith, really, the Jewish community shaped you more?
It was more Jewish family. It certainly wasn't
Yeah.
Jewish
Is there
faith.
such a thing as a, quote, Jewish family?
As a quote Jewish family? I don't know what you mean. But there's very much such a thing as my Jewish family. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
And my extended family too. I mean, I think the world that I know starts there, and everything that I know starts there, and moves out from it. But still, I go rely on it and go back to it, and I'm still close to my family, and I think that's really ultimately the source of my stories, and still. But it's more because, and I did grow up in a very typical religious environment in terms of going to synagogue on the holidays and having a bar mitzvah, but otherwise not particularly. But my parents spoke Yiddish, my grandparents spoke Yiddish, they had accents, they there was this feeling of the old world that still existed within the family to me, and a lot of that has changed since then as people have gone on and that generation has died. But so I felt very Jewish more in the cultural sense, very specific cultural sense of my family.
Tell me about the sentence. You've written a lot of sentences. What is a good sentence? How does it work by itself and in combination with other sentences?
Well, interestingly, for a person who likes clarity, I'm also a great fan of Henry James, who, as we know, wrote very, very long, convoluted sentences where you weren't always sure what they meant until you got to the end of the sentence. But I don't write like that. I do admire clarity and but I do like a kind of consistent rhythm in my sentences and language. I'm quite not sure how else to say it. I also like to. I remember when I started writing, and I remember being very conscious about not repeating the same declarative sentence structures and starting sentences with, ing words and trying to have. But now it comes so naturally to me. I don't really very consciously. It's just become instinct at this point. And I think I'm stylistically, I think I'm really a very consistent writer. I don't think, although there's a fair variety of kinds of books that I've written, I think stylistically there isn't a real variety. I think that the way I write even is quite this, a flow through beginning to end.
How about ideas, preoccupations, themes, philosophic concerns? Do you see certain themes return to time and time again, or some sort of progression on those themes?
I think so. I mean, I definitely know that my characters are often dreamers. They are often people who have a hunger to create something, and this dreaming quality is both a positive and negative thing in their life. It both sustains them, and at the same time, I think sometimes removes them from the real world. This is sounding frightening, familiar to me. But and so I definitely have seen that. But when I think of a story, I usually think of a character in a specific situation. For example, The Student, the new novel, is about a woman who's a Jewish woman in her very early 20s who's an undergraduate student at U of T with ambitions to go to graduate school. And that character came to me. It wasn't a philosophic idea. I think it does deal with but I think it's really it's much more concrete than that. It's much more specific than that. What comes to me is a character, and that character's inner desire, and it's not generalized. It's in a very, very particular kind of setting and situation, and then the story will grow from there, and then I'll find out what it's about. But I mean, it doesn't start with an idea.
It still seems to me, when you look at the student, there's that idea of someone joining a community or leaving a community. You know, somebody joining the academic world, for example, the kind of that we talked about earlier that seems to come up in your books. I mean, is that something that you're aware of, or is that something that I'm making up?
You're definitely not making it up, but I'm just not sure that I have thought so deliberately about it. The funny thing is, the student came. You know, it's hard to separate it from its origins, which is my mother, who's 93 now, and she didn't get to go to university because her father died when she was in high school. She had to quit school and go to work. And that's always, I'm not sure my mother, given the background she came from, would have had the ambition anyway to go to university, but still I know that it was something of a, you know, almost a humiliation for my mother that she wasn't able to finish high school. And in a way, this novel is kind of an alternative life for someone like my mother. It's imagining a woman who did go to, who's almost not quite the same age as my mother. The person would have been born a little later than my mother, but still, it made me think about what if she had gone to university, and so, and there are other circumstances that are quite different, and the character is not at all based on my mother. But in a way, that origin of thinking about family is in a funny way informs a novel that's really even a story that's no way about anything that happened to my family.
See, that's interesting. That makes me want to ask you whether A Bird's Eye has anything to do with your father, or your attempt to sort of understand your father. You know, should he give up his bluegrass? Should he save his marriage and family?
Oh yeah, Valentine's Fall. He said Bird's Eye, but I think Valentine's Fall.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. I don't think I was thinking of my father for that particularly. Yeah, Valentine's Fall is about a young man who's been living in Prague as a musician, but he's not in Prague. In Prague. And he comes back to Toronto and stays with his mother and gets re-involved with his high school friends. And I don't know if I was thinking about my father. I think it was that particular novel. I was really thinking about a way of thinking about my high school years, actually, and not wanting to write a novel about high school itself, but wanting to think about what might have happened to the people one knew back then. So.
The eternal question of what if that every writer...
What if, what if definitely is a great driver of stories.
I'd like to ask you about Canada. Your thoughts on Canada. What is Canada getting right? What do we need to work on? What do you like about this place? What do you not like about it so much?
Well, you know, I don't really feel any more qualified to have any opinions than anyone else. I'm just a fiction writer. I'm not a political commentator. I really love Canada, but I don't really love it in a sort of nationalistic sense. I love it because for the accident that it is my country and that I live here, and I probably would love some other country if I was born there. I love it because it's an extraordinarily beautiful country, and I really, really like to visit other parts of Canada. and I think there are many beautiful places to see and to live. I think Toronto is not the be-all and end-all, even though I can't myself quite imagine living anywhere else. I think, when I do go to other places in the country, I find that people really, even people in Winnipeg love living in Winnipeg, no matter how cold it is in the winter. And I think that we have a relatively good compromise between, freedoms and taking care of our own and taking care of those who need. We have a lot of problems, some of which we're trying to deal with, but I think our model is better than the American one, and so I'm certainly glad for that. I think most of us are probably.
Who are the Canadian authors we must read, according to you? Who are your favorite Canadian authors?
Well, there's a lot of them. I'll probably go back to the ones I read earlier. Norman Levine, Mavis Gallant, the short story writer, is a great favorite of mine. I discovered Alice Munro kind of late, and and maybe that's why, but it's really her later books that I like the best. And they kind of helped to teach me to be more free. I mean, her later, longer stories seem really amazing to me, and she seems so masterful and so in control and free. We keep using those words at the same time, and it really, they feel like stories that she has let really live, that she has not, funneled through an idea of where this story needs to go. And I think that really helped me to learn to be freer.
Maybe also the sense that there are ideas operating in her writing, that they seem so transparent, but there are these ideas sort of hovering over the work.
Right. They're very smart. I mean, she's a very, very smart writer, and she's also shown how sophisticated you can be writing about, say, a small place. I just think she's really opened up, and she's really particularly, I love short stories, so she's really opened that form up.
Now, right now, you've got 5 books coming out. I'm sorry to keep mentioning that,
it's
but
true.
that is just extraordinary. What are you working on right now?
I'm most immediately working on a collection of stories. So the next adult book will be a collection of stories, and I have 7 of them finished, and I need 10, and I have drafts of 2 more. So I'm in pretty good shape, and so that's what I most immediately. I have a kids novel, a short kids novel, which I have my editor that I sent it to. She phoned me the other day because now after having read it, and I said, I can't remember if you always phone me after you've read my manuscripts or only when the response is, And it turned out the response to this one was, It was actually, it turned out to be a little bit better than but she had some really interesting questions about it, which I was grateful to get from her, and so I'm going to go back and do a revision on that, so that after I work on some stories, I'll go back to that kid novel.
Which publishers are you working with right now?
My present adult publisher, I've had many publishers, not always by choice. But Freehand Books is the publisher of The Student. They did a really beautiful job, and they've been really wonderful to work with. And I have 2 primary children's publishers. One is Tundra/Penguin Books, and the other is Groundwood Books. But I also have a book about my father, that graphic picture book is with Owl Kids, coming out with Owl Kids. So.
Now, when you're working on an adult book and you send it to the publisher, Do you send it to them considering or assuming that it's done, or do you send it to them knowing that there's work still to be done?
Yeah, everyone is different, and I don't let anyone read a manuscript until I feel it's really done. So I'll talk about it some. I used to not ever talk about it even. Now I'll talk about it, but I won't let it. When I feel it's ready for the publisher to read it and that it's in really as good a shape as I can make it myself, that's when I will send it. That's when I'll let my wife read it, Rebecca, and maybe possibly one or two other people, and I'll send it. But I have an agent, so through my agent. But I know there are some writers who really want response from their editors or their agents very early in the process, but that's not me. Yeah.
You prefer to keep it to yourself.
I do. I love it being just mine for a long time, and I don't want anyone to tell me what's wrong with it. Maybe it's a defensive thing, but I do want my books to be my own for better or worse, and I'm not just trying to, maybe someone would say, well, it'd be more, commercial if you did this to it. Canadian editors don't really do that, actually. I think Canadian editors just want to publish good books.
Who do you trust, though, when it comes to saying, does your wife give you feedback on your books? Do your children give you feedback? Is there a friend who is your favorite reader?
I have, yes, Rebecca, my wife, who's sitting over there, is my reader, and I try not to burden her too much. But she does, and she read The Student a couple times in manuscript, and and because it's got a partly academic setting, and Rebecca is a prof at U of T, she was particularly helpful. I remember one place in the manuscript which was about some academic thing, and she just wrote in the margin, "This is stupid." She doesn't, mince words, so that was very helpful, and I fixed it from being stupid. So, and I have another friend who I do sometimes, and my kids, who are now grown, have always read my kids' stuff. Do
you get ideas from your children sometimes?
Oh, yeah. Well, unfortunately, they've grown up, but I definitely got ideas for some of the kids' books.
When they were young, what was the best idea you got from them?
I don't know what the best was. I'll tell you one thing, though. I wrote one book really thinking of my daughter, Rachel, which is called Daughter of the Great Zandini, because I loved magic, like conjuring magic tricks and stuff when I was a kid, and I still like magic. And she liked it, and we used to do it together. And so I wrote this story, which is set in turn of the 1900s, or I should say 19th century, in Paris, about a famous magician who wants to hand over the family magic dynasty to the older son, but it's really the daughter who really is the talented one and who wants to become the next magician in the family. And I wrote that for her, and she was pretty, she was maybe 10. And she read the manuscript and liked it a lot, and then I revised it at some point, and she read it again, and she said, "Dad, you wrecked the ending."
How did you do that?
And she said, "Well, because there's this discovery, and the girl made it, and now you have the dad make it, and it was much better when the girl made it." And I said, you're a child, I'm the writer, I know what's best. But sure enough, of course, it really bugged me, and I realized that she was right, and I changed it. I actually found a way of combining both together to make it even better. So she was, but she was right. And there was another. Since I'm on this roll, there's another. I mentioned this picture book thing, and I knew it was good because I read the manuscript to the other daughter, Sophie, and she was quite little, and I read it to her, and then she hugged me afterwards. It seemed like a good sign. And then the next day she said, "Dad, I really love that story." except for the last page. And I said, why didn't you like the last page? And something about endings, I guess. And she couldn't articulate why, but I went back and looked at it, and I realized that she was right. There was something different in the tone. There was something wrong with the last page, and I fixed it. So there you go.
It's interesting when you think that adults go through all this intellectualization of everything, and kids really don't do that to the same degree, and they're often closer to the mark than the adults. You know, that they sort of eliminate the possibilities that you really don't need.
Well, they're often closer to the mark. I think that's true, but they're awfully smart generally. So, and they're getting smarter as I'm getting dumber. So, I think they are good readers, and also they're, you know, the world's changing, and they're better at understanding the world as it's changing. So they're good for that too.
Now, I have one last question for you. But before I ask you this question, is there anything else you want to talk about? Have we missed anything? Do you want to do any PR for any books or anything?
Oh, I hate
The
doing
Student
PR,
coming out in May.
Student is, yeah, it's in the stores, but it's officially, the launch is May 30th, 6 to 8 at the Burdock. And this one, if you just want even have a chance to take a look for fun, my wife and I and a friend run a little publishing house, and we do these limited editions. And I love being involved in running a little publishing. I think it's more fun than publishing big books even. And one of the books we did was a little book of mine, a little book of personal essays about growing up. And I think we do a nice job, so take a look at it. And I like to show them off. But that's about all. I would just say, if anybody here is writing, I wish you luck and joy in it, and to find the pleasure in the writing, even though it's hard.
Let's talk about endings again.
Okay, this sounds ominous.
W.C. Fields proposed that his epitaph read, "All things considered, I'd rather be in Philadelphia." Rodney Dangerfield's epitaph reads, "There goes the neighborhood." What would you like your epitaph to read?
Well, I'm not really good at one-liners. Those guys are going to defeat me. You know, there's one I always loved was what's on John Keats's, you know, I'm not referring that this should be on mine. He wrote, "Here lies one whose name was writ on water," which I think is both very beautiful and at the same time so memorable that it actually does the opposite of what it pretends to do, which I think is kind of interesting. But I think I would just put on mine, "Well, he tried." I think that'll be good enough.
Cary Fagan, he tried. We have time for questions, if anyone has a question.
Thank you. You mentioned how over the years you've improved your work. How did you improve it? Did you take courses? Is it through reading? Is it through discussion with other authors? Also, another little PS question. What was it like to write manuscripts on typewriters before computers, when you could change everything easily?
In retrospect, it was annoying. But the first question, how I didn't really, the only workshop I ever took was that one undergraduate workshop, which I really enjoyed. But so for me, it's really been the two things of just writing, and reading. And I think I remember I recently ran into another writer at a festival, and he said, "I always quote you. Somebody told me this, that you said this once, and it's when people always say, 'Did you read my book?' and I haven't read it." And he said, I say, "Well, Cary Fagan says a writer has to read the books that he needs to read." And I think, and I guess that's a way of getting out of not reading somebody's books. But also, it's really true that I don't always, sometimes, you know, I'm definitely drawn to reading books that are helpful to me, that I learn from. I'm not even always sure why. And sometimes, like there are some of the greatest books I haven't read because they just don't seem like the ones I need to. And in that way, I think I'm not quite the normal kind of reader, although I love reading and I read for pleasure as well. In fact, I used to review a lot, and one of the reasons I stopped because it was destroying my pleasure in reading. And but I definitely learned from other writers. I mean, I think that's and you need to find those writers who have those lessons for you. You know, I do like to read authors who are nothing like me, but I can't learn from them nearly as much. So.
Anyone else? I'll get you and then you.
A Canadian writer who's a great promoter of the short story and who's anthologized a good many of the authors that you recommend is John Metcalf. And I'd like to know, just how do you respond to his work and what he's written and what he's done for the short story in Canada?
Well, I know John, and he actually was the editor of Sleeping Weather, and so I owe him a lot for being a very good editor and accepting that manuscript. And I haven't seen him now for, well, must be 15 years or something. I like him a lot. I think he has I agree with a certain amount of what he's saying. He has kind of a rhetorical, aggressive approach to what's wrong with Canadian literature, particularly with the way academics talk about literature. And basically it boils down to you should not admire something because it's thematically important. Like, you should admire something because it's written well. I think that's really what it comes down to with him. And I partly agree with him and don't fully agree with him. I think that he's probably taken the argument as far as it can go. He's obviously been an extremely valuable and important editor, and he's the fiction editor at Biblioasis, a great literary house. I just read Kathy Page's novel, Dear Evelyn, which is a Biblioasis book, a great book. He's obviously a superb editor, and he continues to discover new writers, and he's really, really important that way. I find his rhetorical essay writing about what's wrong with the Canadian scene a little bit tiresome. I mean, he makes some valuable points, but I think he's hit that nail on the head quite a few times, personally. And but I think as an editor, he does great work, and he's a good writer too. I've read some of his fiction, but not for a long time.
Could you speak a bit more about your relationship with editors in terms of your own manuscripts, both adult fiction and children's fiction? And are there particular editors you've gone back to because of their sensibilities?
Right. Well, as an adult writer, I've published with a lot of different houses, as I say. I mean, I was with Nancy before Freehand, and with Cormorant before Nancy. Sometimes I leave the house, and sometimes the house kicks me out. So my ideal would be to work with the same editor and be at the same house, and it just hasn't. I know that my next book of stories will be with Freehand, so hopefully, I know there's always some manuscripts that are going to have to find a different house, but I'm not. Editors always tell me that I'm one of their less edited authors, that there isn't that much to do in the manuscript. So I've never felt the same dependency that some people have. I mean, that sounds too negative. I think people can have an extremely valuable, positive, close working relationship with an editor. I tend to be a bit more independent, and that being said, the best editors have always pushed the books to be better. And my editor on the new novel was Deborah Willis, and she was really, really good. And this book here is called The Old World, and it's a book of stories based on old found photographs. And then my editor was Melanie Little, who's just a fantastic editor, and I would say she's probably the best editor I've ever had. And she was, the best editors are kind but firm, And they don't, I've worked a couple of times with American editors. I find them much pushier and much more insistent and much more with an eye to the marketplace. And I don't find Canadian editors, they want you to produce the best book that you can do, and they'll help you to do that. And they don't get paid enough to do it. So I'm, for the most part, I've had very few, almost no negative experiences with editors. I've had negative experiences with publishing houses in terms of not answering emails, not paying money they owe, breaking promises. I mean, not most of them, but every once in a while you get a very difficult publisher, and you leave that publisher if you can. So I've definitely had a certain amount of heartbreak from a couple of publishers, but not from the editors. Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Cary Fagan, thank you for coming out.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Cary does have books for sale, and he's willing to sign them if you want to buy them. You can get your advance copy of The Student right here. Thank you all for coming out.